Hello again, I'm Greg. Today, a concept that will be unfamiliar but in some ways necessary and oddly obvious, and that is what I'm going to call contrapaganda. You'll sort of recognize it as the obverse or the converse to propaganda, which we're very familiar with, and we encounter every day, whether it's from governments, from other kinds of institutions, the PR campaigns of corporations, the advertisements in marketing campaigns, all of those and more can be seen as forms of propaganda. Remember that at base, these forms propagate, right? They're not necessarily a negative force. They are, when they're politicized, when they are weaponized, to use a fashionable term, they can become negative. But originally, just to propagate something, to promulge it or promulgate it. Promulge, of course, is a rather Whitman-esque term. But as over against this politicization of propagation in propaganda, we have this term contrapaganda. I'm not going to claim I invented it, but it is an unfamiliar term. In our times, there is a new dynamic amongst the three forms of knowing the Greeks took to be characteristic of human consciousness. This consciousness, too, was, in their times, an utterly novel conception, for only yesterday had logos overtaken mythos as the Ursprach of the mind. The culture of the first idea rapidly realized that logos was of itself three minds: hexis, praxis, and phronesis. That is what the Greeks called them. The first is what is customary in its action and its worldview. Hexis constitutes the knowing we are socialized with and by, and includes what social scientists have referred to as the of course questions, those which are asked only to be met with an absolutely assured sense of being of the truth of things, and as well being in the right. In our current state of unknowing regarding hexis, historically presumed dominance tends to retake the stage. However, we may imagine ourselves this is but a rearguard action characteristic of a period of cultural transition. It could be that, or it could be a true renaissance of these traditional ideas, of which hexis as custom and what is customary is the go-to, the default way of thinking things. So what's an example of an of course question? Well, for a great deal of time, there was a sense that the definition of marriage could only hold if it was between a biological male and a biological female, man and woman, till death do them part. That was marriage. It's not necessarily the anthropological definition, because ethnography has revealed many other forms of marriage. But in our own society, this is, well, of course, that marriage is between a woman and a man. Of late, that has changed, but there are forces afoot that seek to curb that change, to resist it, and to kind of roll it back and say, no, that is right after all. And that is part of hexis. So the patent list of these of course questions reemerges, but this time as potential tokens for an ideology. Okay, hexis is not immediately and by definition propaganda, but it can be used for propagandistic purposes. So if we expand this list, queries such as, is there a God? Motions the way to, is God always on our side? Or are there only two genders? To, should I only love the other gender? And the like. You can see how these questions kind of slip and shift and slide towards other kinds of thoughts. But hexis is itself of value only to the local group. The Greeks understood this rather too clearly. For all other cultures they called barbarians. They were thus barbaric, given how highly valued they valued their own. This too should present an easy clue for us today. The more highly we think of ourselves, if such esteem is stationed only in what is customary, in hexis, inevitably leads to the disparagement of the other, and that at best. Custom being simply what is done and nothing other, is by definition an unquestioned form of knowing, for it in turn lacks the ability to question meaning, only sense. Custom presents to the young person a how-to in relation to getting along in one's culture of birth. It is both a blueprint and a manual, and takes the culture it is expressing as a given, and thus everything in it and about it. And yet we cannot summarily disdain Hexis in itself, for each of us needs, most essentially, just such a cultural manual, right? If I didn't have that, I wouldn't even know how to function in my own society, okay? So we can't sort of sit there and sort of say, oh, Hexis is by definition a bad thing. No, not at all. It's something that's absolutely necessary for a human life. At the same time, it is insufficient for it, and we'll come to that soon enough. Indeed, these same social scientists refer to insanity as simply being the state of unsocialization. The person in question has, at base, no clue how to behave or yet to think. Hexis is but the template for the two other forms of knowing, insufficient again for the new consciousness, but still utterly necessary to it. What is the next one then? The Greeks called it praxis. It's often glossed as applied theory, and this is not incorrect, just somewhat incomplete. Unlike hexis, which is almost soaked in by the child, praxis must be formally taught. The Greeks were the first culture in the West to conjure praxis as a relatively serious discourse, to be distinguished from hexis, and very often in direct opposition, even contradiction, to it. Today, praxis begins to be encountered in grade school, but its truer home is in the university. This is the institutional space of the disciplines, discursive, questioning, and striving for objectivity in all things. Of course, praxis has its own paradigms, within which only a certain range of questions can be posed. Even so, the very fact that questioning actually occurs within such frames constitutes a radical step away from the unquestioning hexis. Practical or applied theory speaks to us at another level of knowing, and its questions include: how did the concept of God arise? And why do people imagine such a being to be there on their side? As well as, where did the idea of gender come from? To what are the advantages or no of framing sexual relations as binary? And so on. One can immediately see why praxis is a threat to hexis, but as long as such questions remain academic, as it were, the threat is itself minimal. And it is this limitation which praxis tends toward. This is ironic, of course, perhaps more than that. Such limits emanate from at least two basic sources. One, the philosopher is also a human being who must thus live on in this or that culture. And two, institutions tend to see themselves as clearinghouses for discourse and not as revolutionary or visionary fonts. It is the students who attend them who begin to put two and two together, though they too are often guilty of imagining that praxis is simply an extension of hexis, since in their ardor to question all things, they seek to establish praxis as a higher form of custom. The permanent revolution rather requires that praxis be kept stringently apart from hexis, and indeed, since the puzzles hexis cannot itself solve, have given rise to this second form of knowing in the first place. Praxis is thus beholden to hexis for both its inspiration and for its objects. And given this somewhat unquiet marriage, institutions, especially the schools, teach theory as a form of custom. The critical edge of praxis is thus muted, taking itself for another tool or skill. Defenders of hexis grant praxis the right to exist, but only sanction its ability to take action in the technical sphere alone. This is the core reason why our prosthetic godhead races forward and our system of beliefs which supports it lags far behind. Okay, this is old hat. That technology accelerates in terms of its pace of change, and yet the customs and mores and morals that backdrop it, that provide the essence of our culture, seem to stagnate and move ever so slowly, almost insignificantly, even over the course of a human lifetime. Okay? So this is a stark contrast between our tools and the thinking that gives them their existence. Okay? And it's a grand contradiction that is only exacerbated in modernity. So what can we do about that? Let's explore a little further first. The fact that the thinker remains, at least marginally, and by birth, if not necessarily officially, and by act, a being of a specific time and place, forces upon praxis a dialectical reckoning. The outcome of bracketing aspects of both custom and theory, while uplifting syncretic elements, is what the Greeks called phronesis. This is our third term, or practical wisdom. Phronesis asks neither what has been done nor what could be done, but rather, what is the wisdom of doing such in this way? Custom points to the past, theory to the future, but practical wisdom, as its gloss implies, is centered on the present day and our lives within such days, those as we know the best, and thus can call our own. Phronesis is thus open to comers from both the culture and the discourses, from both religion and science, from both belief and fact. It takes it as plausible that any culture which has survived however long must indeed have some seeds of wisdom within it, and this often in spite of what is customary being hopelessly narrow, and thence exhibiting in its worldview a narrow-mindedness. Phronesis takes this as inevitable. The provinciality of any specific set of customs cannot be helped, nor can it help itself without the aid of praxis. But praxis, too, in setting itself up over against hexes, tends to overlook any potential wisdom the latter does, in fact, exhibit. Is it entirely mistaken to imagine higher forms of being? Why then do we ourselves strive to better our own beings, either as individuals or as a species? Is it entirely bigoted to demarcate male and female? If not, then from where and whence does the next generation of humanity arise? One can immediately see why phronesis values critical reflection, but as an ethic and not merely as a method, as it appears in praxis. That's worth repeating. Phronesis is critique. It embodies it, but it embodies it as an ethics, whereas praxis, applied theory, embodies critique only as a method. It's almost as if it's saying that praxis engages in critique for the sake of critique itself. Okay? And phronesis takes it another step further. Thus, practical wisdom is wise, due to its ability to take from both custom and theory relevant aspects of the wider consciousness. And it is practical because it then takes these elements as a practice, and not simply as either a given, as in hexis, or as an idea, as in praxis. Phronesis occupies the apex of a simple dialectical diagram wherein hexis is the thesis, praxis the antithesis, and phronesis the synthesis. All of us begin thetically, as it were, and around age 12 or so begin to participate antithetically, each as is necessary as is the other. There is, of course, no specific age when wisdom suddenly kicks in, and each may learn this deeper and wider perspective at any moment of the adult life. For human beings, it is dying, which places us on the final course toward completed being, but most of us experience a number of dress rehearsals for such final acts, however dramatic or mundane. In these do we touch the drape Sophia does herself don in order to communicate with mortal life. Yet all of this is, in an odd sense, a form of historical pseudo-hexis. For today, we have added to this dialectic three specifically modern forms of knowing that deviate to a degree from those now taken to be traditional, triune, and truthful. In our own days, we also encounter information, misinformation, and even disinformation. How does this recent trinity, which refers to sources of knowing, fit in with that of the Greeks? Okay, for the Greeks, these three conceptions didn't exist at all. If the Greeks were concerned with meaning and that their take on things was hermeneutic, in our time we are more geared into the sense of things and thus favor the analytic. Hexis has itself been elevated and given a speciation which it could not have simply by itself. Custom had always been on the surface about sense, how things are done, how one behaves, and how one believes. In a word, hexis allows us to make sense of our culture of birth and everything associated with it. But even the stuff of custom cannot be referred to as mere information, for it too imparts meaning and not just sense. Indeed, information alone does not generate sense. Its elements are, rather, pieces of a puzzle, which, when assembled, presents a sensible picture of a part of the world. And so it very much matters how we put them together, for the image we seek is not part of the assemblage of the elements themselves. Information taken by itself is a mechanical solidarity. Its whole is equal to the sum of its parts. In this, it gives the impression of hexis, but in fact, even what is customary generates a gestalt, the very culture its customs honor, and in which finds their source. This gestalt does itself mean that its whole is more than the sum of its parts, just as the early Gestalt psychologists spoke of it being thought of as a melody, as opposed to merely a series of musical notes. We hear the melody, not the notes, just as we live in a culture and not in custom. So information can only be, by itself, additional notes that we may or may not be able to piece together into a melody. Beyond this, the two other aspects of our contemporary technical knowing, misinformation and disinformation, present further challenges to human wisdom. It is as if we are determined to overdetermine sense, and thus the process of making sense of our life world and its diverse augmentations. Misinformation may be distinguished from disinformation simply by acknowledging that, in the case of the former, mere ignorance or incompetence is at work. In other words, there is no willing or intentional lack of perspective or knowledge at hand in misinformation. It is simply an error of either judgment or technique. Misinformation can generally be overcome by righting one's ship, correcting mistakes, and maintaining an alertness to the ever-present possibility that within information itself can be carried its own saboteur. But it is elsewise with disinformation. Here, there is indeed a willing ignorance afoot, sourced in either personal manipulation, the con artist, the groomer, the cad, or in institutional propaganda. While the culture critic is, at this juncture, eager to point out that Hexis does itself have its own forces of disinformation at its disposal, isn't the entire edifice of this or that culture an exercise in mass brainwashing? We should keep in mind that once again, Hexis contains elements of wisdom that phronesis does itself make into a reflective and critical practice. Within disinformation, we find no possibility of either of those. Disinformation is born in politics, but matures in marketing. And this is the very face of what, to honest minds, would be anathema to it. Why would the one who seeks my alliance lie to me about his vision? Why would the one who seeks my business lie to me about his product? It is in some ways a definitive moment when honesty does itself become simply another commodity, another manner of putting oneself forward, to be used ad hoc, or yet tactically, in combination with dishonesty, as well as statistic. One is honest only when it benefits the cause at hand. This is no relativization per se, but rather an outright redefinition of being truthful, and thus as well a reframing of what constitutes a truth. Truth has been excised from both hexis and praxis and put to use as part of the pseudo-dialectic which forms of technical knowing exhibited today. For disinformation is not so much a synthesis of elements which are either informative or misinformative, but rather an amalgam of the sense which both the other forms possess. If I consistently mix truth and lie, their once distinct characters begin to blur together. The technical triangle, which begins with the thesis information, is rather more akin to that of the commodity, whereupon production is the thesis, consumption the antithesis, and fetish the synthesis. And while it too is true that the truth has itself been fetishized in almost a primordial manner, this fetish had been that of pre-commodity relations. Local truth is the fetish of hexis. The original society worships only itself. But today, with truth and lie reduced to, at the least, symbolic commodities, the third term that envelops both is simply the term correct, in that the savvy person knows how and when to be honest or dishonest in the correct manner to further her aims or his cause. The challenge for the rest of us is not to dive bodily into the pseudo-dialectic of either technique or commodity, but instead to exercise the philosophical or historical dialectic which seeks a critical and reflective synthesis. This means placing information to the side, specifically within praxis, and engaging in a negative ontology regarding its place in consciousness. Praxis exerted a successful demythology against hexis, and now we must apply a specific kind of deontology to information. In so doing, a contrapaganda is created, the act of grounding information within the wider culture as well as the singular psyche, and thence exposing disinformation as the effort to present a false vision to this ground advantage. For the whole of modernity thus far, we have relied upon art to counter the false consciousness. But with the advent of information, as the general lingua franca of politics, economics, and the technical and applied sciences, we require a different response, one that does not seek to overcome through transcendence, as did art, but rather seeks the immediate and consistent confrontation of the face-to-face and at each turn. Only then may we regain the practical wisdom of truth and lie alike. Thank you for listening.